welcome to Stage Screen and In Between with Helen. I'm HELEN Proimos. Today we have a very special show for you. We have Karen Q, who is the owner of Patriot Tours NYC. Now, Karen usually does tours, walking tours in New York City, but because of the lockdown due to the pandemic, she is doing her shows virtually. Karen, welcome. So glad you could be here.
Hi, Helen. Thank you for having me.
I saw you last night online on Facebook Live. You were doing a talk about Aaron Burr. It was so interesting.
Yes, I was. And while I'm not able to go out and do my tours live and in person, I've decided to do some virtual tours so people can still enjoy the great storytelling.
Yeah, I think as you get older, you really appreciate history more because you don't have to learn it.
That's right. That's right. It's more an option. Plus, I think as you get older, you understand some of the themes and circumstances, and you understand how people are a little bit better, and you can maybe relate to it better too.
Yeah, you look through it, look at it with different eyes. So tell everybody about your background because you weren't always doing this.
Right. Well, when I got out of college, I went to Wall Street where I worked in the math and technology field. I used to develop risk models on technology platforms, and I did that for many years. I left due to stress in 2002, and I had enough money to not have to work for a while. So I went back to something I loved as a teenager, the American Revolution, and I started reading all kinds of original documents. You know, here in the New York City area, we are incredibly gifted in that we have many museums and historical societies that have documents left over from that time period that are available for anyone to see upon request. So I started reading those old newspapers and letters and things, and was just completely fascinated. I did it for 2 years. And when I decided to go back to my Wall Street job, one of my friends said, you know, don't go back to work, you should start a tour. So in 2005, I started my Revolutionary War walking tour, which got very popular. And as a result of that, I started doing a tour about Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. For you guys out further on Long Island near Setauket, I do a New York-based Culper Spiring tour, so you can learn all about the spiring from Setauket, the part of it that operated in New York City. And just as this pandemic started, I was getting ready for my newest tour, New York City Live with Mrs. Q. And I was planning to go out on weekends dressed in one of my colonial outfits and do the tour live that way. Unfortunately, we're all locked in now, so that'll have to wait.
Yeah, so we'll do it this way for a while, right? So what are some of the most interesting places that you've been to?
In Lower Manhattan, there are so many great places that you can visit. St. Paul's Chapel, for instance, one of the oldest structures still standing on Manhattan Island, built in 1766 by the Old Church of England. There's so much history in that building and in the graveyard. It's so much fun to go. They have wonderful artwork on display. Also Trinity Church, its sister church or its parent church, and its graveyard dating all the way back to the 1680s. And of course, Francis Tavern at Pearl and Broad Street, built in 1719. There are so many great places to visit in Lower Manhattan.
Yeah, it's amazing that some of them are still standing, like the tavern you mentioned. I believe it's still there, isn't it?
It's still there. It was originally a home for a family whose name you might know. They were called the Delanceys. The Delanceys were a wealthy merchant family, and in 1719, they built that building as their home. It later became a tavern, but that is one of the oldest. And the two churches, of course, the churches are owned by Trinity Church, and lucky for us, Trinity Church is a massively wealthy organization and keeps both churches historically accurate to the time they were built.
Now, part of Lower Manhattan was landfill, wasn't it?
Yes. So for those of you who know Lower Manhattan well, Pearl Street on the east side was the original shore, and Greenwich Street on the west side. So the original town was only about half a mile wide. And you know, if you stand at Wall Street and Pearl Street, that original shore, and you look directly across Wall Street to Trinity Church, you're seeing the entire width of colonial New York. That was all. The landfill came much later, some of it in the 1690s, some in the early 1800s, and some on the west side in the 20th century.
So now, was New York basically farmland?
most of the colony of New York was farmland. I guess maybe 95% of it. New York City was only from where, if you know where Chambers Street is, where City Hall is located, from there to the southern tip of the island. Everything else was farmland or woodland. Farmland up to just north of Greenwich Village today, and then woodland from Greenwich Village to the top of the island. And all those places we call the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, would all have been farmland and woodland.
So now, last night you did a story about Aaron Burr, and how fascinating is Aaron Burr for you?
Aaron Burr is incredibly fascinating because the person we know today doesn't bear any resemblance to the Aaron Burr who actually lived. And that's not uncommon in history.
So now he also had a daughter, and I believe that you're an author, and you've just written a book about her.
I did. I wrote a book about her. Her name was Theodosia Burr. The book is called Theodosia Burr, Teen Eyewitness to the Founding of the New Nation. And I have a copy here. Everyone would like to see it. I'll try to get it out of the glare as best I can. And it's a young adult biography of Theodosia Burr. And I wrote it kind of as an inspiration to young adults and teenagers who are struggling with their identity, because Theodosia struggled with hers as well. She was the only young lady of her time, so this would be New York in the 1790s, who did not sew or do embroidery or cook or any of those ladies' things. She instead learned English, history, philosophy, Latin, Greek, and geography. Her parents were very radical in their ideas about women's education and sought to make her the first fully educated woman of her time. So the book is about her struggles to be the only one of her kind, and also parallels the struggles of New York City as a brand new city in a brand new country.
Was she an only child?
She was technically an only child. So she was the only child Aaron Burr had with his wife, Theodosia, and who he recognized as a child of his.
Yes. Now, Aaron Burr was a slave owner, but he did a lot to try to free the slaves, didn't he?
He did. Aaron's family did own slaves, but he came from an old New England Presbyterian tradition, which of course were the Puritans, who were abolitionists and against slavery. So when Aaron Burr became an adult and inherited the family slaves, he freed them all. Many chose to stay on in his home as servants. And Aaron saw to the education of all of his servants so they all could read and write. Some of them were fluent in multiple languages. He had a young man servant who was French, who helped Theodosia with her French lessons. He also allowed his servants to use his library. He paid for them to go to school, and he even left land for a couple of them.
Now, when Theodosia married, she married a rice farmer, right? But he did become a politician, am I correct?
Yes, so it's all about politics, right? Aaron himself, is really a lawyer, but he becomes a politician. So her husband will become a politician as well. She married Joseph Alston of Charleston, South Carolina. He himself had been trained as a lawyer by Edward Rutledge, the youngest signer of the Declaration of Independence. Alston was also a graduate of Princeton, as was Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr's father, by the way, was the founder of Princeton.
Imagine that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Aaron Burr comes from a highly respected intellectual background. His whole family is renowned. His father studied with the great Jonathan Edwards. Aaron's father attended Yale at 13. He then started Princeton. Aaron himself passed the entrance exam at Princeton when he was 11, but was not admitted until he was 13. So he comes from a renowned intellectual background. So Joseph Alston was trained in that tradition as well, but he didn't like the law. So he took over his father's failing rice plantation and turned it into the most profitable rice plantation in the South. When he and Theodosia married, she had just turned 18 and he was 22. And she went off to help run the plantation, but she mostly ran his political career. And in just a few years, Joseph Alston became the governor of South Carolina.
So she wouldn't have been sitting home sewing an outfit, a costume like you're wearing right now. Would the women of that time sew their own clothes?
That depended on your class. So If you were a working class woman, yes, you would make your own clothes. So if you were a woman who was a servant, or, well, if you were a seamstress or a mantua maker, as they would have called her, of course, you'd make your own clothes because it was your business. A lady like Mrs. Q, who would be from the new wealth merchant class, so not as wealthy as the landed gentry, but the new wealth in New York, might make the undergarments. So under here, I'm wearing a muslin gown, which is an all-purpose gown that you might wear to bed, or you would sleep in. The men and women both wore those, and she might make those. But all of the other clothes you see, she would have made by her dressmaker, her mantua maker.
So tell us something about the actual outfit that you have on now. Is that from like 1760?
Yes, it is. So this would be popular in the 1760s. I'll stand up so you can see it a little bit better. And you can see it has sort of a jacket type look, and it flares out in the back. The shape is very nice because I'm wearing that big, girdle type thing called stays, which lace
Yes.
you the shape for the clothes. The clothes are actually fitted to the stays. So if I tried to put this on without the stays, they wouldn't fit me properly. The inner piece you see here underneath is called a stomacher, and this sometimes is the same fabric as the jacket piece, or it could be a contrasting fabric. Sometimes it has bows or ribbons or flowers on it, and this is very popular for the 1760s. The skirt is very big and flowing, and of course everyone would wear a scarf, usually a plain white scarf, but I like this one, so I wear it. Now, today I'm not wearing it, but if I was doing one of my in-person appearances, I would also be wearing what was called the bum pillow, which is a pillow that goes on your butt and hips. It makes everything huge. It just really accentuates the whole look.
Like a petticoat from the 50s.
Yeah, just huge. But instead of like going out like a V, it kind of flows out like this. And right after this, and I do have one of those dresses, the popular dress has a bodice, which in the back comes to a point. And then the skirt, of course, would flare out from the point. So when the gentleman was looking at a lady from behind, he would see this lovely V silhouette from her shoulders down to her tiny waist, and then a huge flaring out, which I guess was, an attractive silhouette, desirable at that time. And let me tell you, the stays, no matter what your shape, will mold you into that silhouette once you lace them up. They're great for forming your body into, a nice V shape.
What do people find the most interesting about your tours?
Well, that depends on where they're from. So people from the general New York City area, many of them have rarely been in Lower Manhattan in their life because, as you know, it used to be the financial district, and who would go there unless they worked there? So for them, they kind of have an idea about the American Revolution, but they're fascinated by Lower Manhattan, and they look around and say, wow, I've never been down here before. So for them, a lot of it is the experience as a New Yorker of learning about your city in a way you never viewed it before. For people from the East Coast who have a little bit more of an attachment to the American Revolution, it's more a historic experience. People from the West Coast, it's all totally new to them. And for some people, they're just, staring in amazement at everything because, in Lower Manhattan, you have, the World Trade Center and the Oculus, you have huge office buildings, and then you have little tiny, landmarks from the 18th century. So for some people, it's also a bit overwhelming.
Yeah, it's amazing that it's still there. What do you find fascinating?
Well, when you go walk through Lower Manhattan, and when I worked there when I was younger, this is what intrigued me, was I could never figure out the logic of the layout of the streets. So, if you've been down there, they're not in
They're
a grid at all.
winding.
Right,
They're
they
winding.
twist and turn, they go in every kind of crazy direction, and that's because they still maintain the layout from the 16 and 1700s. And for the town at that time, the streets make sense. Well, the New York City Landmark Preservation Commission not only preserves the direction of those streets, but also the width. So you're seeing the exact width they were. And in some cases, that's just wide enough for
They're
two
narrow.
carriages.
Yeah, narrow. Now, there are famous people buried in a lot of the cemeteries there, right?
Right. So if we were to go to Trinity Graveyard, which is one of the oldest cemeteries, beginning in the 1680s, we find a signer of the Declaration of Independence, Mr. Francis Lewis. And we also find probably now the most famous grave in that graveyard, Alexander Hamilton, who's buried there with his wife, Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton. There are also a number of Revolutionary War generals and commanders buried in Trinity Church, as well as St. Paul's Chapel.
Now, the main means of communication back then was newspapers, letter writing, correct?
Yes. So you got your newspaper once a week. Newspapers were very difficult to print. They had to set each letter by hand. They were only 4 pages long, and they came out weekly. And often the news was old news. You probably already heard it from your neighbors. So a lot of the news was not even local. It was from abroad, or it was from the other colonies. And there might be a few letters to the editor, but half of that newspaper was classified ads, just like the classified ads we see today. So you're probably not going to go to your newspapers for current news or debate. For that, you might go to pamphlets. And a lot of people are familiar with Thomas Paine's famous pamphlet, Common Sense, published in 1776. So for a pamphlet, you would write that. You would shop it around to printers, just like you might a publisher today. And if a printer thought it was worthwhile and that he would make money on it, he'll print it for you and sell it in his shop. And then one of your opponents will write an opposing pamphlet calling you a fool. So pamphlets, though, are still for people who can afford to buy them. For the average people, we have broadsides. Broadsides, you or I could write a broadside. As a matter of fact, there was a lady in New York who wrote some broadsides chastising the other ladies. And you would write it, take it to a printer, and he would print it usually on a large sheet of paper. And you would buy those yourself. Of course, you're going to sign it with a pseudonym or a fake name. You don't want anyone to know who you are. And during the night, you and your friends will put them up, post them around the town. So the next day, everyone reads your broadside. And then your opponent, excuse me, will put one up a couple days later, right next to yours, refuting yours. So
yeah, well, politicians were doing a lot of backbiting even then, right? Because nowadays, we have a little fake news, and I would imagine that in their broadsides, they had some fake news too.
Well, let me tell you, when I first started reading broadsides in newspapers, I was under the impression, as many of us are today, that they told the truth then. And I got caught up in a couple of really hilarious falsehoods thinking they were true, until I realized that it was all fake news then. It was all biased. The only difference was at that time, everyone knew it was biased. So everybody printed their own opinion and was loud and demonstrative about their opinion. As a matter of fact, if you tried to be objective, people would believe that you were either too cowardly to stand for something, or you were too deceptive to tell anyone what side you were on. So everything is biased, but everyone knows it's biased. So once you learn that and you begin to read the stuff in its context of who was who and who was feuding with whom, you start to understand better. But, I might share it again. Maybe I'll share it again next week. Some time ago, I wrote a social media post about how it was all fake news with examples of stuff that was published in New York from both sides.
That's interesting. How important was honor back then and having a duel?
Honor was everything. So when you wrote your pamphlet or you wrote your broadside, you would use a pseudonym, because generally in that publication, you would be very blatantly and humorously insulting your opponent, and the insults would be highly personal. By using a pseudonym, even though your opponent knew it was you who wrote it, there was social deniability. You could see each other in public, you could pretend you didn't know who wrote what about you, and you could therefore not have to call each other out and have a duel.
What about courting back then? How did people hook up?
It depended as well on class. So if you were of the wealthy Delancey family, or some people in the Hudson Valley, remember the Livingston family, it's likely you would maybe be in a semi-arranged marriage, or you would certainly have to marry somebody from one of those other families. For instance, Sarah Livingston married John Jay. The Livingstons and Jays were both very wealthy families in the Hudson Valley. So a lot of those marriages would be among your own kind. For the class like Mrs. Q, this upcoming wealthy merchant class, some of those marriages would be among your friends. So in the Hudson Valley especially, it was encouraged that children created a set of friends starting when they were around 6 or 7 years old. And the set would contain the same number of boys and girls. And this set would remain friends throughout their childhood and teen years, and would generally select their mate from within that little group of friends.
So it's kind of like hanging out with the crowd.
It is, and they would call it a set. And I think even in the 50s, they called it a set, right? I mean, I think old movies, they would call a group of people who hung out together a set. So
Well, I don't know, but
or
what
maybe
was
the
the life
40s.
expectancy? What was the life expectancy?
Life expectancy, now I thought people died young, but they didn't always. And I found that looking at people's lifespan, that if you seem to make it through the late 50s and 60s, you lived a long time into the 80s or 90s. But there seemed to be an age in there where you were susceptible to disease and illness and death. And if you made it past that age, you lived a long time. Now, there was a high infant mortality rate, and also a lot of children died as toddlers. So when you look through the graveyards, you see many children not living past the age of 3 or 4. And as a matter of fact, Theodosia Burr had a sister who died when she was 5.
Ah. So what did people do for entertainment? Did they dance?
Sure, and the dances were incredibly complex. Like square dancing is a descendant of the dancing at that time. So you would start learning to dance when you were 7 or 8 years old with your friends. Your parents would hire a dance master who would come and teach all of you. And of course, there was no recorded music, so they had to bring a violinist or a fiddler with them who would play the music, and the dance master would teach you all these complex dances so that when you came out into society in your teens, you were already capable of executing all of these difficult dance steps.
So now getting back to politics a little bit, most of the founding fathers, weren't they attorneys? They were lawyers?
Everybody was a lawyer, right? John Adams was a lawyer. Alexander Hamilton was a lawyer. James Madison was a lawyer. Aaron Burr was a lawyer. So they're all lawyers. And for the Declaration of Independence, we really needed those lawyers, because in order to break away from England, we had to prove our case legally, that we had the right to separate from them. And they did that in the middle part of the Declaration of Independence. So if you get out your Declaration of Independence and you read that middle part, it lists all of the things King George did that they said were in violation of the English Constitution and what was called the common law. And they said, therefore, since he has violated these things, we have the right to declare ourselves a free and independent country. So they used that legal argument then to do that. Later, the lawyers wrote the Constitution, right? So then we had guys who didn't like the Constitution so much. They called themselves anti-federalists. They didn't like the structure of the Constitution. Many of them were lawyers, but some of them were not. And here in New York City, there was a wonderful broadside that told New Yorkers, stop electing lawyers to represent you. They're all lawyers in the Senate. Don't elect them to the House. The lawyers make everything too complicated so that only they can understand it. And it was the lawyers who brought us this horrible Constitution. And it was signed a true anti-federalist, and in big letters, and not a lawyer.
So now when you go outside again and you have your tours, how long do your tours last?
They run from 2 to 2.5 hours, depending on how quickly the group is moving through the area. It can be a very congested area in normal times. And we move at a very leisurely pace. And the length of the tour is really pretty short because the whole area is not even 1 square mile. So we're not traveling very far. And I do try to create tour stops that have places to sit at every stop, because I do get a lot of retired and elderly people on my tours and want to accommodate them as well.
Yeah. So now that's back in the days of horses and carriages. Did the average household own a horse?
No, that depended on your status as well. And you're probably familiar with an area called Murray Hill. Murray Hill was named for the Murray family, a very wealthy shipping family. They owned a dock at Wall Street, and Mary Murray was the first lady in New York to have her own private carriage. So that would have been a sign of massive wealth to have your own carriage. Generally, everyone rented a carriage. And, you know, we had traffic jams from the carriages. And the men in the town would complain that they walked everywhere because they said every lady in this town must have a carriage to go even 2 blocks. And it takes an hour to get 4 blocks from Wall Street to the harbor. So the men, I guess, walked while the ladies all, you know, took the carriages. But I'll tell you, if you wore these clothes and these shoes on those unpaved, muddy streets, you would probably want a carriage too.
And how difficult was it to cook in the oven? I mean, they didn't have electricity yet. So what was cooking in an oven like back then?
Well, I don't know if you've been to any of them, but if you go to some of the historic houses, you can see they had just a huge type fireplace, which served as their cooking area. And the larger houses had a little oven built into the side of the fireplace. It would be like a brick oven, we would call it. And everything was cooked over that fire. It was incredibly hot. Was maybe nice in the winter because we didn't have heating up here yet. And they would cook over that fire. A lot of people, employed cooks to cook for them. Some families weren't that wealthy, so all of the girls in the family would cook together. That was the job of the girls in the family. And you would learn to cook very young from your mom.
What was the weekly wage back then? Do you know?
I don't know what it was. In New York, many people worked for themselves. New York was a haven for what was the independent master artisan. So many people worked for themselves at a trade, and they would hire, a journeyman, they would call it, or an apprentice who they would train. So people set their own hours and made income on what they sold. People also bartered, and we have records showing that both Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Burr, for their law services, took things like eggs, chickens. We have one incident where somebody gave Mr. Burr a pig that they had for dinner. So you can see there was different types of currency and ways of paying each other at that time.
Bartering. Well, we're almost out of time, and it's been a delight to speak with you, Karen. Thank you so much for sharing. And if you would tell our audience where they can get in touch with you, find out more, take a tour.
Sure, you can always find me if you use Facebook at the Patriot Tours NYC Facebook page. I post every day a little history story about New York, and at 7 p.m. on Thursdays, I live stream as Mrs. Q. You can also go to the website, patriottoursnyc.com, which describes all of my tours, and when we start working again, you can book them there. And there's also a Patriot Tours YouTube channel where I'm going to be posting more short videos. There's currently a short 30-minute video there of Mrs. Q giving a tour of colonial New York City.
Well, thank you so much, Mrs. Q. You've been watching Stage Screen and In Between with Helen. If you like that page on Facebook, you can find out more about where my show will be broadcasting. I'm also on YouTube. Give it a like. Thank you, and thank you.